Hello and welcome to this video clip giving an overview of TUPE. Now TUPE is a type of topic that can bring HR professionals out in a cold sweat, and it may be that you go through your HR career having never experienced a TUPE situation. You may work in an organisation where TUPE is commonplace because of how the organisation operates and the type of work it undertakes. And you even find HR professionals who actually make TUPE their day-to-day work, so working with organisations to help in business transfer situations. Now, it is a subject that can be quite complex, particularly when you apply it to an actual situation. So this video clip is meant just as an overview, so almost like an introduction to TUPE itself. Also note that this has been recorded in July 2019, a point at which the UK is still part of the EU. Now, TUPE is EU legislation, so it may be that when the UK eventually leaves the EU, that the legislation changes. So just be aware of that. So when it comes to defining TUPE, I think it's worthwhile actually looking at the individual words that make up the acronym TUPE, because they actually tell you what TUPE is about. So if you take them in two parts, you start with the T in U. So the T in U stands for transfer of undertakings. Okay, and that's an important part of TUPE because effectively it defines whether TUPE applies or not. So an undertaking in this situation is work effectively. So an undertaking involves people undertaking tasks in a workplace or as part of the organisation. So therefore a transfer of undertaking is when that work moves, and we'll go through the scenarios that apply in a second. And the P in the E stands for protection of employment. So what the legislation is basically saying is that if the undertaking is transferred, so if the work moves, then the people undertaking that work are protected. So in essence, they should move with the work. Okay. So TUPE is the abbreviation that is often used, and that applies to the transfer of undertaking to protection of employment legislation 2006. And like I say, this is EU legislation, so therefore you find that it's more about protecting the employees because it's based on the social chapter. So if you go back to the purpose of employment legislation video, it's also available. I talk there about the purpose of legislation, how that is slightly different when the legislation is EU based versus UK based. Okay. So when you look at TUPE, when TUPE applies, effectively there are kind of two broad categories. So the first one is in the case of a business transfer. Now the business transfer typically is an acquisition, so one business buying another business, but can also be a merger. The second example, or the second category, is a service provision change. So typically in something like a change of a contract. So for example, as an organisation you outsource something like cleaning, IT, HR even, then that is a transfer, so the work is transferring in that situation. Now there's the various kind of checklists, etc., to establish whether an undertaking has been transferred, but the main thing from a HR professional's point of view is to be able to identify when a transfer or when an undertaking has been moved or is about to be moved, because it's at that point the TUPE legislation and all the process and the requirements around it should kick in. Okay, so for example, if you look at a business transfer, if you just say, well, actually the work has ceased to exist, well, where's the work gone? If it's transferred to another organisation, then that is a business transfer. But if it's ceased to take place full stop, then TUPE wouldn't apply. That would be a redundancy situation potentially. So that's when TUPE applies. When you look at the main rights protected, again, that falls into two broad categories. So individuals affected by a TUPE, they're entitled to transfer over to the new organisation, so the organisation that is now undertaking the work, on the same terms and conditions on which they were previously employed. And the timeline of that is completely unlimited. So if they transfer to the new organisation, stay on the organisation for the rest of their working life, they're entitled to the same terms and conditions. Okay. The other area is around continuity of service. So when they transfer over, however long their service has been previous to the transfer, they maintain that, and that builds on. Now that's important, first of all from an employment rights point of view, because we all know that the right to claim unfair dismissal accrues only after 2 years. So that is maintained. But also, if at a later date that individual is then made redundant, then their redundancy calculation is based on their entire employment rather than just when they've been with a new organisation. So that's the important area. And there are other legal requirements around rights that are protected. So, for example, it's automatically unlawful to dismiss someone in the new organisation just because they have transferred over. Okay. There are a lot of other legal requirements, so I've very much kind of abbreviated here. So the legal requirements in terms of consultation, the information that transfers between the parties, there's something called the ETO reason, and also pensions. And so the key, like I say, the key thing here is to identify when a TUPE situation has occurred, and then to make sure you refer to the relevant information. In terms of the source of information, I've included in the comments section below links to ACAS guidance, which is quite good at giving a general overview. And there's also a couple of CIPD guides as well. So there's a fact sheet and also a detailed guide. Well, hopefully that's been useful, giving a basic overview of TUPE. And like I say, it is an area that's quite complex. So my aim here is to help identify what is TUPE and what rights are protected.